Here is something the NHRA has never said out loud. In the first 2 seasons of pro stock drag racing, the class they had spent years designing, the class they had built from scratch around the concept of fair, competitive, multi-manufacturer racing, Chrysler won 12 of the 15 national events. 12 out of 15. And those weren't close races. They weren't photo finishes where the Dodge and Plymouth cars barely edged out the competition. They were systematic, methodical, race after race demolitions of everything Ford and Chevrolet and everyone else could put on a trailer and tow to the starting line. But here is what the record books don't tell you. The car that made all of that possible didn't start in pro stock. It started 2 years earlier in super stock. And when it arrived, it was so far beyond anything the NHRA had written rules for that they reclassified it twice in 2 years and eventually had to build an entirely new class just to contain it. It was not a purpose-built race car from a factory in Italy. It was not an exotic prototype developed by engineers with unlimited budgets and no rules to follow. It was a compact car, a Dodge Dart, the same body shell that suburban Americans were driving to grocery stores and church parking lots all across the country. Except this one had a 426 cubic inch Hemi under the hood. And the NHRA, the organization that prided itself on writing rules that kept racing fair and competitive, had no idea what to do about it. Not because it was illegal, because it was perfectly, completely, devastatingly legal. And that was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. Before we talk about the car, you need to understand the man who built the engine inside it. Because the Dodge Dart and the 426 Hemi are inseparable. You cannot tell the story of one without telling the story of the other. And the story of the 426 Hemi begins not in a boardroom and not in a press release, but in a one-car garage in the Detroit suburbs in the late 1950s. His name was Tom Hoover. He had been born in Huntington, Pennsylvania in 1929. He had served in Korea, earning a sergeant's rank and 3 Bronze Campaign stars. He had come home, earned a degree in physics and a master's in engineering at Penn State, and gone to work at Chrysler Corporation in 1955. At Chrysler, he discovered drag racing the way some men discover a vocation. Not as a career choice, not as a calculated decision, but as something that simply took hold of him and would not let go. He and 8 other Chrysler engineers began spending their weekends building and racing cars. Their first project was a 1949 Plymouth business coupe they called the High and Mighty. The intake manifold was a piece of experimental hardware that stuck out through the hood and ran back over the roofline, 48 inches long. The exhaust used trumpet-shaped horns for each cylinder, based on a theory Hoover had read about in a Norton motorcycle technical paper. It was, by any conventional measurement, a completely insane thing to bolt onto a streetcar. It was also extraordinarily fast. The group called themselves the Ram Chargers, and for the next decade, they were the most technically innovative racing team in American drag racing. Not because they had the biggest budget, not because they had the most sophisticated facility, because they were engineers who applied everything they knew about physics and thermodynamics and fluid dynamics to the question of how to make a car go faster down a quarter-mile strip. Every innovation they developed in the garage on weak Endies found its way eventually into Chrysler's production programs. The cross-ram intake manifold, the tunnel ram, tuned length exhaust headers, altered wheelbase cars, the modern funny car concept. All of it started with the Ram Chargers, in garages, on weekends, because Tom Hoover and 8 other Chrysler engineers couldn't stop thinking about drag racing. By 1962, Hoover was head of the race engine group at Chrysler, and he had built the Max Wedge, a 413 cubic inch big block that had made Chrysler's 409 Chevrolet and 421 Pontiac rivals look outdated almost overnight. The Max Wedge dominated drag racing in 1962 and 1963, the way Chrysler engines tended to dominate things when Tom Hoover was paying attention. But the Max Wedge had a problem. It was brilliant at the drag strip. On a NASCAR superspeedway, it was not competitive. In April of 1963, Chrysler's chairman Lynn Townsend summoned Hoover to his office and gave him a single, specific instruction: win the 1964 Daytona 500. Hoover went back to his drawing board. He had less than a year. He had a team of engineers. He had the Chrysler RB block, the same foundation as the Max Wedge, and he had a concept that had been proven in T. He 1950s on Chrysler's early production engines, hemispherical combustion chambers. The idea was not new. What was new was applying it to a purpose-built race engine on the specific timeline that Townsend had demanded. Frank Bialp drew the first engineering layout of the new Hemi head on March 23, 1963. The original blueprint listed its completion date as May 3rd of the same year. From the first drawing to the final design, 6 weeks. The engine they produced had 2.25-inch intake valves, exhaust valves at 1.94 inches, free-flowing ports, hemispherical combustion chambers, and a capacity of 426 cubic inches. The factory rated it at 425 horsepower. The engineers who built it knew it produced considerably more. They called it the elephant motor because of its size, because of what it did to everything it raced against. At the 1964 Daytona 500, Richard Petty drove a Hemi-powered Plymouth and lapped the entire field. The top 3 finishers were all Hemi cars. It was not a race. It was a demonstration. And it was the engine that 4 years later would end up in a Dodge Dart that terrified the NHRA for the rest of the decade. NASCAR banned the 426 Hemi for the 1965 season. They said, it was not a production engine and could not be homologated for competition. Chrysler boycotted NASCAR entirely. They refused to participate in the series at all for 1965 rather than accept what they considered an unjust exclusion of an engine that their competitors had not found a legitimate way to beat. The 426 Hemi went to the drag strips, and Tom Hoover, who had spent 10 years in the Ram Chargers learning every nuance of what made a drag racing car fast, turned the Hemi program loose on superstock competition with the full weight of the Chrysler factory behind it. The results were the same as they had been at Daytona: total, systematic, methodical domination. By 1965, special factory-built, superstock-oriented Dodges and Plymouths with 426 Hemi engines were available through the dealer network. The cars were built at Chrysler's Hamtramck plant, pulled off the line partway through assembly, and sent to contractors for conversion to race specification. Lighter components, race-prepared engines, stripped interiors. The same basic concept that would produce the Hemi Dart in 1968, 3 years before the Hemi Dart existed. The competitors tried to keep up. The NHRA kept adjusting. The rules. The Hemi-powered Chrysler cars kept winning. By 1967, Chrysler decided they needed something more decisive, something that went further than what they had been doing, something that took the concept of maximum engine and minimum body to its logical conclusion, something that the rules had not been written to stop because nobody had yet imagined it would exist. One morning in early 1968, Dodge dealerships across the United States received a press release from corporate headquarters. It informed dealers that Chrysler intended to sell through their showrooms to anyone with the money and the nerve to buy one a factory-built drag racing car, a purpose-built race weapon assembled by professional racing engineers, stripped of everything that was not essential to going very fast in a very straight line, fitted with the 426 race Hemi. The car was the Dodge Dart, a compact, a sensible, perfectly ordinary American compact that shared its body shell with people who drove to church on Sundays and picked their children up from school on weekday afternoons. What Chrysler had put inside it was something that had no business being in any car that a private citizen could purchase. Register and drive on a public road. Now Chrysler's own corporate rules specifically prohibited Dodge from factory installing the 426 Hemi into the Dart. Too radical. Too far beyond what a compact car was supposed to be. Too far beyond the engine clearances that the Dart's engine bay had been designed to accommodate. So Dodge found a workaround. They contracted the build to Hurst Performance in Madison Heights, Michigan. Partially assembled Dart GT's bodies were shipped to Hurst stripped of their engines, transmissions, exhausts, interiors, and accessories. Everything that was going back in as race hardware. When those cars arrived, the engineers discovered immediately what Chrysler's corporate prohibition had been quietly acknowledging. The Hemi did not fit in a Dart, not without modifications that would never be made on a production line. The passenger-side shock tower had to be hammered literally. with a hammer to create clearance for the Hemi's massive valve covers. Larger wheel well openings were cut for the racing slicks. The battery was relocated to the trunk. The rear seat was deleted entirely. The front seats were replaced with the lighter units from Emma Dodge A100 van. The carpet, the radio, the heater, the armrests, every comfort feature that added weight without adding elapsed time, all of it came out. The hood and front fenders were replaced with fiberglass. The sheet metal was acid dipped to remove every possible ounce of unnecessary weight. When Hurst was finished, the car weighed approximately 3,000 pounds. The engine inside it, the 426 race Hemi, with 12.5-to-1 compression pistons, cross-ram aluminum intake manifold, dual 735 CFM Holley carburetors, and hooker headers running straight out the sides produced somewhere between 500 and 550 horsepower. The factory rating said 425. The factory rating was theater. Every engineer who had spent 5 minutes around this engine knew the truth. 80 of these cars were built. Not 800, not 8,000, 80. Each one came with a disclaimer. Used for drag racing or supervised acceleration trials only. Not because Chrysler was being cautious. Because they knew exactly what they had built, and they wanted it on record that anyone who pointed it at a public road had been warned. What they had built was the fastest factory-produced drag car in American history at that time. And Dick Landy was about to show the NHRA exactly what that meant. Richard Lee Landy grew up in Gardena, California, and spent his working life in Northridge, a few miles from the San Fernando Valley drag strips where serious Southern California racing happened in the 1950s and 1960s. He was not a farm kid who stumbled into racing. He was a businessman. He ran Dick Landy Industries, a performance parts and engine building operation who approached drag racing with the same systematic, analytical precision that he brought to every other part of his professional life. He had been racing seriously since the early 1960s. He had factory Dodge support since 1962. He had built altered wheelbase cars, competed in the A/FX class, run match races across the country, and accumulated a reputation that made other competitors uncomfortable when they saw his car in the staging lanes. They called him Dandy Dick, not as an insult, as a description of the way he operated. Immaculately prepared cars, perfect setups, a stogie in the corner of his mouth, and the calm, unhurried manner of a man who had calculated the outcome before the Christmas tree lit up. When Chrysler delivered an LO23 Hemi Dart to Landy in early 1968, he already knew what he was looking at. He had been part of the conversation that produced these cars. He understood the formula. He understood the weight break calculations that gave the Hemi Dart its advantage. And he understood, from the moment he put a timing slip on the car at the track, that the NHRA's Superstock class structure had not been designed with this combination in mind. The factory said the car would run the quarter mile in the high tens at 130 miles per hour, straight from the build. Drivers with properly tuned LO23s were running deep into the nines almost immediately. Not in heavily modified cars, not with exotic equipment beyond what the build spec called for. In cars that were essentially as delivered from Hurst Performance, with tune-ups that the drivers and their mechanics had developed through testing. 9-second quarter miles. At a time when the Superstock weight break formula had been calculated around a world where 10 seconds was fast. The NHRA looked at what was happening and moved the Hemi Dart from SS/B into SS/A. It kept winning. They moved it again, SS/A Hemi. A new designation, the T acknowledged in the language of the rulebook that this car was not competing in the same universe as the cars around it. It kept winning. Ronnie Sox won the NHRA U.S. Nationals SS/B title in 1969 in his Hemi Barracuda, the direct corporate sibling of the Hemi Dart, built on the same program by the same engineers. Ron Mancini won it in 1970. The reputation of these cars was sealed at the biggest event in American drag racing 2 years in a row. And then the NHRA did something they had not done for any other car in the history of the Superstock class. They built a permanent, dedicated class specifically for the Hemi Dart and Barracuda program, Superstock American Hemi, SS/AH, a class that acknowledged in its very existence that the NHRA had run out of ways to contain these cars through reclassification alone. that the only remaining option was to give them their own space and let them race each other, because putting them in any class with other cars produced the same result. The other cars lost. In the autumn of 1969, 4 drag racers sat down with the NHRA's leadership and proposed a new class. The 4 men were Dick Landy, Ronnie Sox, Bill Jenkins, and Don Nicholson. The concept was simple. Factory-bodied cars. No handicapping, no index times, stock frames, the maximum allowed engine displacement with a universal weight factor of 7 pounds per cubic inch. First car to the finish line wins. They called it Pro Stock. It was Landy's class. One of the 4 men who built it from a concept into a reality that would become the most technically sophisticated, naturally aspirated drag racing category in American motorsport. The irony in what followed was considerable. Pro Stock launched at the 1970 NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona, California. Bill Jenkins won the inaugural event in his Camaro. Then the Mopar teams found their footing, and what happened was not a competitive class. It was the Hemi Dart story, repeated at the Pro Stock level. In 1970 and 1971 combined, Hemi-powered Chrysler cars won 12 of the 15 NHRA Pro Stock national events. Ronnie Sox won 9 times. His 6 wins from 6 final round appearances in 1971 Pomona, Gainesville, Dallas, Montreal, Indianapolis, Ontario remain one of the most dominant single-season performances in the history of the class. At the end of the 1971 season, NHRA competition director Steve Gibbs said at PL, anally and publicly. At the end of 1971, there was no doubt that Chrysler had achieved total domination of Pro Stock, and the class was bound to suffer. That winter, the NHRA rewrote the rulebook. For 1972, 3 separate weight-to-cubic-inch structures were created. Straight inline valve wedge engines ran at 6.75 pounds per cubic inch, staggered valve engines at 7 pounds. Hemi cylinder head cars, the cars that had won 12 of the 15 races in the class's first 2 seasons, were required to run at 7.25 pounds per cubic inch. In addition, subcompact cars, the Chevrolet Vega, the Ford Pinto, were now allowed to run with small block engines at the lighter wedge weight. Bill Jenkins' 331 cubic inch small block Vega qualified 17th at the 1972 Winter Nationals. He made some suspension adjustments overnight. He won the race. He won 6 of the 8 events that season and took the championship. Jenkins himself was direct about the mathematics. His Vega could run at 2,200 pounds legally. Ronnie Sox's Hemi car had to weigh 3,100 pounds. Both engines were producing roughly the same horsepower per cubic inch, 900 pounds. That was the weight break the NHRA had built into T. He classed to stop the Hemi. Plymouth had run a national advertising campaign in 1965 after NASCAR banned their Hemi from Grand National competition. The headline had read, "If you can't beat them, outlaw them." They were right in 1965. They were right again in the winter of 1971. Ronnie Sox drove into the 1972 season with the same car that had won 6 events the year before. The same engine, the same team, the same preparation. He did not win another NHRA national event for the rest of his career. Not one. The man who had put up 9 wins in 2 seasons, who had been the most dominant driver in the class since its creation, who had made the Hemi program look so far ahead of the competition that the NHRA had been forced to rebuild the class structure to survive it, went to final rounds, ran the car well, and lost. Not because he had gotten worse, because 900 extra pounds of mandated weight had made the car he was driving into a different car than the one that had won in 1971. Dick Landy understood it from the moment the new rules were published. He had been one of Pro Stock's founding fathers. He had built his career in the NHRA. He had raced for Chrysler since 1962, run factory Dodge cars through Super Stock and the A/FX era, and now Pro Stock, and he had always operated within the framework of the organization because the framework had always, at least in principle, been built on the idea of fair competition. After the 1972 rules took effect, Landy moved his Pro Stock program to the AHRA, the American Hot Rod Association, a competing sanctioning body with different rules and a different relationship with the Hemi engine. He won the AHRA Pro Stock Championship in 1973. He won it again in 1974. Back-to-back championships in a class where the rules had not been rewritten specifically to stop him. Throughout the summer racing seasons of those years, Landy was also running match races across the country at local strips, at unsanctioned events, at any facility that wanted to put a factory Dodge Pro Stocker on their property and sell tickets to people who wanted to watch Dandy Dick and the Hemi run. Landy traveled with the United States racing team, a group of top pro stock drivers who ran match races at tracks across the country when the NHRA national event schedule wasn't in session. Sox was there. Jenkins was there. Don Nicholson was there. Herb M. C. Candless, Wayne Gap, Wally Booth. The names that had defined the class in its first years, now running on smaller stages for crowds that had come specifically to see them. The local strips that hosted these match races were not the Winter Nationals. They were not Indianapolis. They were tracks in the middle of the country, fairground strips and drag parks with bleachers that held a few thousand people, that sold their best attendance of the year on the Saturday night when a match race card brought factory-backed pro stockers to their property. The crowds that came were not primarily NHRA followers. They were ordinary Americans who loved performance cars, who had read about these drivers in Hot Rod magazine and Carcraft, who knew what the 426 Hemi meant and wanted to hear what it sounded like when it was running down a quarter-mile track at 140 miles per hour with nothing between them and it but a piece of orange snow fence. The NHRA had changed the rules to stop these cars from winning championships. The cars went on match racing tours instead, and the people who loved them followed. The 80 LO23 Hemi darts built at Hearst Performance in 1968 lived the only kind of life they would. Here designed to live. They were raced hard by men who had purchased them specifically for that purpose and had no interest in preserving them. Many were crashed. Most were rebuilt and raced again. Engines were pulled, rebuilt, upgraded, replaced. Bodies were repaired, repainted, sometimes swapped for lighter aftermarket alternatives as the technology of the late 1960s and early 1970s made new materials available. The exact number of survivors today is unknown. Nobody has been able to establish a definitive count of how many of the 80 cars still exist in any form, because the record-keeping of a production run this small and this specialized was not designed with future historians in mind. Cars were sold, resold, wrecked, parted out. The paper trail that connects a specific vehicle identification number to a specific car racing in a specific class in a specific year is fragmentary, incomplete, and in some cases irretrievably lost. What is known is that they ran at NHRA national events through the early 1970s in the SS/AH class that had been built for them. They ran at AHRA events. They ran at match races. They ran at local strip events where a promoter had managed to book one of the factory-backed Hemi cars and was selling tickets on the basis of that booking. Dick Landy campaigned his LO23 through the late 1960s and then moved into challenger-based pro stock cars as the classes evolved. His specific Hemi Dart, the car he drove at the Winter Nationals, the car with his name on the deck lid and his engine program under the hood, survived. It was restored. It came to represent not just his career but the entire era of factory superstock racing that the Hemi Dart had defined. Ronnie Sox, whose Plymouth Barracuda had been built on the identical program, raced his car until the weight breaks of 1972 made it non-competitive at the national level. The Barracuda program went the same way as the Dart program to match races, to local events, to the places where the rules had not been rewritten to stop them. The men who raced the LO23s remember them the way men remember things that changed the shape of their lives, not as mechanical objects, as experiences. The Hemi at operating temperature in a car with no mufflers and headers running straight out the sides, idling in the staging lanes at the top of the track waiting for the previous pair to clear producing. GA note at idle that had no equivalent in any other production vehicle on the planet. A deep, mechanical, fundamental sound that arrived in the chest of everyone standing near it before it reached their ears. The sound of an engine containing 550 horsepower in a package that weighed 3,000 pounds, doing nothing more strenuous than idling, waiting to be pointed at a quarter mile of asphalt and released. The competitors who staged alongside an LO-23 heard that sound. The NHRA officials who walked the staging lanes heard it too, and they understood from the first moment that they were looking at something for which the rule book as written had no adequate response. Walk through the NHRA's own records. The reclassification from SS/B to SS/A is there. The creation of the SS/A Hemi designation is there. The SS/A H-Class Superstock American Hemi, a permanent category created because reclassification had run out of options, is there. 12 wins from 15 events in the first 2 pro stock seasons are there. Ronnie Sox's 6 wins from 6 final rounds in 1971 are there. Steve Gibbs's public statement about total Chrysler domination is there. The 3-tier weight brake structure introduced for 1972, giving the Hemi cars the heaviest formula and the subcompact small block cars the lightest, is there. What is not in any official NHRA document, what the organization has never written in a press release or stated at a rules meeting on the record, is the sentence that every one of those entries points toward. We changed the rules because one car was too good and we had no other way to stop it. They never said it, but the record books say it for them. The NHRA's competition director said at the end of 1971 that Chrysler had achieved total domination and the class was bound to suffer. That statement is the closest any official of the organization ever came to acknowledging what the Hemi Dart had done. That a compact car, built by a factory in Highland Park and finished in a shop in Madison Heights, with an engine designed in less than a year by a man who had started drag racing on weekends in a 1949 Plymouth, had walked into every class the NHRA placed it in and made the class look inadequate. Tom Hoover left Chrysler in 1979. He spent his remaining years connected to the sport he had helped define. He raced a vintage Max Wedge Plymouth H with his son. He appeared at events. He signed blueprints of the engine he had created. He was given honorary titles father of the 426 Hemi, godfather of the Hemi, the Pope of the Hemi by a racing community that understood what he had done. Dick Landy died on January 11, 2007. He was 69 years old. His 1964 Dodge 330, the car considered by many historians to be the world's first funny car, the foundation of the line that led to the Hemi Dart, sits in the Museum of American Speed in Lincoln, Nebraska. The NHRA Hall of Fame has never inducted Dick Landy, the man who was one of 4 people who invented the class that became the NHRA's premier naturally aspirated category. The man who drove the car that made the organization rewrite Superstock twice and create a new class entirely. The man who, when the rules were changed to stop his engine, won back-to-back championships in a competing sanctioning body rather than accept a formula that had been engineered against him. Not in the Hall of Fame. Some things the record books record, some things they don't. But the Hemi Dart story is there in every category that was built to stop it and couldn't. In every rule that was written in. Response to a timing slip. In every weight brake that was adjusted because the number at the bottom of that slip was a number the formula hadn't been designed to produce. Plymouth said it in 1965 when NASCAR banned their engine. If you can't beat them, outlaw them. The NHRA never outlawed the Hemi Dart. They just made sure it could never win again. And in doing so, they wrote the most honest acknowledgement in the history of their sport. That the Dodge Dart, a sensible, ordinary, everyday American compact with a Hemi under the hood and nothing left inside that wasn't essential to going fast, was the most dangerous thing they had ever seen on a drag strip, and they were terrified of it.